Awesome. Well, I'm David.
And I'm Nick. This is our entry for our historical and unethical studies group project. We chose to do the UCLA study on schizophrenia from the 1980s. So I'll kind of go ahead and let David kick it off here.
All right. So we couldn't find the original study parameters. The study started in 1983. And the original primary physicians on the study were Keith H. Nuechertlin. I still can't pronounce it. Nuechertlin, Nuechtlerlein, and Dr. Michael J. Gitlin out of UCLA, both psychiatrists. And they wanted to put a longitudinal study together that focused on a couple of things. Primarily, they wanted to set out to identify what could predict the relapse of schizophrenia, and then overarching on that, study and describe the course of the illness in patients long term, hence the longitudinal study.
Mm-hmm.
Around 1988, 89-ish, a couple of unfortunate events happened, and I'll mention one. One of them was, I believe, a patient by the name of.
I have that.
Yep.
Where'd it go? Oh man.
So there's one Antonio Lamorid.
Mm-hmm.
He was actually a UCLA student at the time, in law school.
That's the law school one. Yeah.
Yep. He ended up having a psychotic break, where he was talking to his parents, his family about, or not parents, sorry, his family about suicide. Both of his parents were deceased. His brother specifically, and ended up jumping off of a roof of the school and committing suicide.
Sad.
And sad. And another patient, I believe it was Mark Allers.
I got Gregory.
Gregory Allers, sorry.
Yep.
Gregory Allers. He was taken off his medication, and then he started having hallucinations, and another psychotic break where he was starting to kill his parents, believed that he was being followed, that aliens were telling him to run for president, a whole, slew of things, basically the result of part of the study parameters, which is these patients were recruited under the understanding that they would receive free treatment at UCLA. That included medication, counseling, etc. And at some point, once they were stabilized, they would be progressively weaned and removed from their medication to see how they responded without medication. The notion being that these antipsychotic medications that treat schizophrenia have horrible side effects. So what is it? Tardive dyskinesia, tremors. The medications themselves can actually cause different forms of psychosis. All of these, if they're used for long periods of time.
And I believe several patients actually did, in fact, have a lot of those symptoms with like tardive dyskinesia and stuff like that, which was leading to a lot of other pretty serious medical issues as well.
Yes, and previous studies had shown that if patients are properly weaned and maintain counseling, a lot of them don't have once they're stabilized and their neurotransmitter levels are stabilized as well. They don't have any incidents of psychosis moving forward. But another reason for the study is these doctors wanted to see if patients did relapse. They wanted to see the signs and symptoms that led up to that relapse, and then subsequently what happened after that relapse.
There's a lot of. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so I was saying that's where we get into the ethical gray area.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And there was like a lot of like medication study that along that kind of parallel a lot of that, like which medications were better in different relapse situations.
Hmm.
So there was a lot of really good things that this study was trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
It crossed a lot of ethical gray area, especially when it came to the informed consent that um, these uh, patients were kind of receiving.
Yep. And so the informed consent that these patients signed stated, and I quote from the actual informed consent they signed: "My condition may improve, worsen, or remain unchanged. In that, I may also benefit from the study being taken off my medication in a careful way while under the close medical supervision of UCLA and its staff."
And
So,
that's that close supervision thing that kind of didn't quite happen as much.
and we'll circle back to that at the end
Yeah,
to
yeah.
answer some questions. But yeah, in general, to answer that first question on the template, what was the aim of the study and what knowledge was learned from the study? In the subsequent published studies, they did learn a lot of things. That there was a lot of sympathetic nervous system triggers and signs that occurred in these patients leading up to their subsequent relapses. The issue being that they let these patients relapse into such a deep psychosis, and sometimes in the case of what was it, the Allers kid, the
Mhm.
Greg, for 9 months before putting them back on medication. So
Yeah.
yeah, yep. All
I
right,
think we'll move on to number two
yeah.
here. So, concerning the five human rights of self determination, privacy and dignity, anonymity and confidentiality, fair treatment, and protections from discomforts, harm, which of these was violated in the study and why? How?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest one, I think there were several, but the biggest one was protections from discomfort and harm. Um,
Absolutely.
for my thing, and
Mhm.
I'll read the quote from the actual study itself, or at least the quote that the two study leaders, Dr. Cherlin and Dr. Gitlin, gave in response or in their paper. Of their study. So they said one important improvement over the previous studies of relapses in schizophrenia is that relapse was defined as the elevation of psychiatric symptoms to the severe or extremely severe level. In contrast to the studies that defined the period of observation to be observation by the necessity to increase medication to avoid a possible relapse, we can be certain that any predictive changes that we isolated in this study actually did precede a clear relapse. So it's that last line. We can be certain that any predictive changes that we isolated in the study actually did precede a relapse. The families that ended up suing
Mhm.
UCLA, they interpreted that is that when patients were showing symptoms of deterioration and functioning, the researchers deliberately failed to intervene for the welfare of their patients in order to measure and track the development of the more severe symptoms. So they basically didn't stop it when they could have stopped it, and that's
Yep.
that's the issue there. Yeah.
Yeah, and they essentially the article kind of goes on to say that they did really very little, um, and that basically, yeah, it just kind of kept going and just like this for quite some time before it was really kind of um, ever really taken um, to the point of like this is a big giant ethical problem. Like years,
Yep.
yeah, like what 95 I think is when they finally released some of this
Yes.
stuff, became public
So,
knowledge.
so 95 is when the press got a hold of it. 94 were the lawsuits, and 93 was the um, federal review of the study. So the Federal Office for Protection from Research Risks, OPRR, ended up finding that UCLA's informed consent documents were missing some required elements. And they were very vague in what those elements were.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't actually describe it. They just their statement was missing some required elements. UCLA was also directed to stop recruiting new subjects until a revised form was approved by the university's ethics committee to obtain new consents from patients currently participating in the study. In addition, the agency strongly recommended, but did not require, that previous subjects be appraised of the new consent forms. I find that line very interesting.
Yeah.
Yes. So the federal government stepped in and was basically like, you didn't really have informed consent. It was very, very vague. The patient's families do have a case in that you did not fully explain what could happen or the severity of what could happen.
Exactly.
And to even, the worst thing is that they provided no safety net, or it seems like they provided no safety net for these negative outcomes when they could have. So
yeah, it just they really kind of didn't do a very good job on. I really think like how much of this kind of changed the course of the future for how like studies and ethics were like are made for, in order for people to do studies, like they have to go through these ethics, kind of loopholes now because of this study.
Yeah. So that was, protections from discomfort and harm, and then of course the other one was self-determination. So clearly, these patients did not have any, self-determination in choosing their own course of treatment, or when things got too bad where they couldn't advocate for themselves because of their disease, their families had no course of action to, they tried to get them back on their meds, and the researchers didn't return calls, said that, everything was being managed when it wasn't. Yeah, it was kind of.
Was the original study, was it like a double blind where they're using placebos, or were they just pulled off? I don't recall seeing how they managed if they thought they were taking the medications or what.
Right. And I can't remember. I saw some mention of a placebo, but I don't necessarily know if it was in the Gitlin other guy whose name I still can't pronounce.
Because the only one that I could really find is the review of the literature that kind of talked about kind of a global overarching of these studies that happened back then,
where some researchers were using a placebo to see what happened with patients if they were continuing taking their medication and weren't actually taking it. But yeah, definitely self-determination and discomfort and harm were the big ones in that.
All right. So moving on here, what ethical principles are at stake considering the autonomy, justice, beneficence? Beneficence, is that it?
Beneficence,
beneficence and non-malfeasance. So I think for the biggest one here, the ethical principle would be non-malfeasance. Would be kind of one of the big ones for this particular study.
Hold on one second. Sorry.
Okay. Pause it. And we're back. So non-malfeasance. So basically do no harm. I think that was one of the big ethical issues because, they, in like what you were talking about, the end of that statement, that quote that you had, where they knew that that those patients had deteriorated to such a point that and they still didn't do anything about it. They weren't returning the phone calls. They just kind of let them go, and just let them relapse. And I think that's just one of the major, ethical boundaries that is just shouldn't happen.
And so, so to back that up, in some of our reading, and I think this was one of the articles from a media outlet, but they quoted Edward Fuller Torrey, who is a psychiatrist who specializes in schizophrenia for the National Institute on Mental Health, so the NIMH. And he's written a bunch of papers on the disease and has done research himself. And he said, I've been around the research arena enough to know that it is important to have some oversight. Left to ourselves, we don't always do what's best for the patient. We think we do, but we also have an extraordinary ability to rationalize our behavior as being in the patient's best interest, where sometimes it may not be.
such a science like approach to things, and you I mean, sometimes, I mean, I know in like a patient care, like, especially in like an emergency setting, like sometimes you have to remove yourself, from that, it being a person in order to do what you need to do,
Yeah.
like, I know in the emergency room, you get a bad trauma or something like that. I can understand that a little bit, but
Mhm.
you still have to put your patient first and still remind yourself that it's people that you're dealing with.
Yeah. And I think it's still, I think, coming back to the non-malfeasance, it loops back into the informed consent. And like even to this day, another psychiatrist who was commenting on the UCLA study, Dr. Katz, who's a psychiatrist at Yale University, he wrote in actually one of the law journals, that was an op-ed in the law journal debating, informed consent and whether it's good enough or not. He said that uh, the idea that patients are actually have informed consent is an act of empty ritual, which I found
Empty
really
ritual.
empty ritual.
Oof.
Here, sign this paper. It's a cover our ass, not your ass,
Yeah.
situation. Yep. And so, yeah. Anyway.
Uh, what nursing
Mhm.
code of ethic provisions highlight the nurse's obligations in this study? I mean, we highlighted a lot of them. For sake of time, I think we should probably only cover a couple. We could briefly cover the one, but I think 3.5 is the biggest one for sure.
For sure. Let's see. I think I
Yeah,
got that up here.
I'm
You got
pulling them.
pulling it
Yeah, I'm
up.
pulling them up too.
So A&A, nursing A&A, code of ethics.
So 1.4, the right to self-determination. Let's see, respect for human dignity requires the recognition of specific patient rights, particularly the right of self-determination. So autonomy, basically.
Yep.
And we kind of already really touched on that the patients weren't really given that option or ability, and even when they did want to get back on their medication, they weren't necessarily really even given that option by the
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, I think we already kind of covered that one a lot. Um, let's see, 2.1, which is primacy of the patient's interests.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah,
So
is
the
the
nurses, yeah, the nurse's primary commitment is to the recipient of the nursing and healthcare services, the
mhm.
patient, whether the patient is an individual, a family, a group, or community. Nursing holds a fundamental commitment to the uniqueness of the individual patient. Therefore, any plan of care must reflect that uniqueness. So in this case, we're dealing with severely mentally ill patients who, after a certain point, cannot, under any normal circumstances, advocate for themselves, and that should be taken in consideration. And it was not in this study.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So 3.3, informed consent.
Yep. Literally.
That I mean, that really just kind of speaks for itself. Honestly, we've already talked a lot about. Was it 3.3 informed
Yeah.
consent?
3.3,
Yeah.
protection of participants in research.
Yes, which
Yep.
covers basically informed consent. So yeah,
Yep.
we've touched on that one a lot. But they just need to be told what's going to happen exactly, and
Mm-hmm.
what it is that they're signing up for. See here. Additionally, the patient should be informed of how data will be that's protected. Research, how the research is going to be conducted,
Mm-hmm.
and timelines and whatnot. So
Yeah.
and that just really wasn't taken into consideration at all.
Yep.
So
And the big
three,
one.
yep, the big one, 3.5, acting on questionable practice. The nurse's primary commitment is to health, well-being, and safety to the patient across the lifespan and in all settings in which healthcare needs are addressed. As an advocate for the patient, the nurse must be alert and take appropriate action regarding any instances of incompetent, unethical, illegal, or impaired practice by any member of the healthcare team, um, or healthcare system, and any action in part of others that places the rights and best interests of the patient in
In
jeopardy.
jeopardy. Yeah.
So, if put yourself in as a researcher in those times and think about like you have a patient that is clearly deteriorating, and you're just going to let that go, I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, there, there's no way to know if there were nurses involved in
Right.
the care of these patients in the study. I mean, I'm sure there is a way to know, but in our extensive Googling, we could not find out. But I mean, I'm assuming with between medication administration, patient interviews, all of the other paperwork that had to be compiled, there had to be some kind of other medical professional other than the psychiatrists and
Mm-hmm.
the research students involved who, you know, were ethically obligated when they saw these patients deteriorating. When they came in, I mean, the two patients that we know of whose families ended up suing these doctors had clinical visits every other week where they would come in and be asked about the state of their psychosis or their schizophrenia after they had relapsed. So they knew
Right.
the state of these patients and they still did not act on it. And that's
Yeah.
just horrible.
Mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Um, how could the study have been altered? What could have been implemented in the study to make it more ethical? I mean, we've kind of really basically all the things we said we shouldn't do, we should not do, and we should implement other, informed consent. They should know exactly what they're getting themselves into. There should be people who are acting as advocates for the patients, you know, um,
Yep.
and being able to advocate that this person needs to get back. Something bad is going to happen. There needs to
Yeah.
be, in this instance, maybe adding more, um, you know, psychiatry sessions or something, to better help these patients. Maybe in other ways other than just medication. You
Yeah.
know,
And this was the 80s. So this is
mhm.
well not well before. I mean, medical power of attorney existed, but it was not as well known and practiced and advocated for in the medical system as it is today. And so having patients that have mental disorders that could eventually not advocate for themselves or be able to take care of themselves or make medical decisions for themselves, having a medical power of attorney in place for research subjects who can help direct their care when they do, if and when they do become incapacitated, has to be part of every study. I mean, it's just,
Absolutely.
and that was, I think, the issue of the family of the person who committed suicide, Tony.
Yeah, because he had no family.
He didn't have his mom and father were dead, so he had no, and they didn't consider his brother or his aunt who raised
That's right.
him. I remember reading that
Hmm.
his actual family member. So when they called to try to help, get him help or direct his care, they just said, no, you're not a family
Hmm.
member. And so that just found that crazy. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, the federal government did step in. It was a slap on the wrist. It wasn't,
Hmm.
they shut the study down until they fixed the informed consent.
Right.
Um, and so that was pretty much the only change made to the study moving forward. From what I also read, that they may have actually increased the safety net a little bit, but I couldn't get any concrete evidence that said, um, you know, closer attention was paid to the actual timeline of relapse to versus when they started medical therapy again. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, I do know. I think I threw that stat at you about. Yeah, the UCLA study began in 1983, and the study was still going on as of 2010 because again, longitudinal study.
Hmm.
23 of the initial 50 patients that underwent treatment for schizophrenia suffered severe relapses after their medication was stopped. And of those 23 patients, several of those patients had more than one episode of severe relapse during the study, including hallucinations and paranoia. So I feel like when almost half of your study is in that state, you kind of
Yeah.
got to rethink your process a little bit. So
Exactly.
yeah.
So here's the big question to top everything off. Is there ever a time when knowledge gained from unethical study outweighs the duty to treat subjects in an ethical manner? So essentially, is what they did, is it worth the scientific knowledge that was gained? Was it worth it?
Uh, in this case, not in my opinion.
No, not mine
Um,
either.
uh, the I think I mean I don't have the exact statistics, but from my understanding, at least from our mental health class, schizophrenia is still a somewhat rare and really hard disease to diagnose. But
Hmm.
even if it is diagnosed, it's still a rare occurrence. So,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, I think that's why it took so long to publish these results, is because they had to literally find patients that,
Yeah.
which
It,
are
it,
really hard to find. Yeah.
because there's no, you can't study on animals. You have to
Right.
use people. And they actually quoted that in as part of some of the rationale as to why they did what they did, was because
Yeah.
they didn't have animal subjects to study and they had to use people, and they were just kind of trial by fire is kind of what their one of their big go-to um, rationales were for stepping out of some of those ethical boundaries, I feel like. But I still don't think the research was worth um, those. I mean, no research I think is worth any life, really. But
I think it's, I mean, we kind of saw it with COVID. I think you have to leave it up to the public to decide what is, you know, so when they were doing the large clinical trials for the initial COVID vaccine, it was after the disease had already ravaged and made news. So when the volunteers for those initial clinical trials of the vaccine were signing informed consent, they knew what they were getting into.
mhm,
They had a they were I feel like those volunteers were doing it more out of a sense of public duty
right,
than than and so yeah, I feel like you kind of when pushing the boundaries of science, you kind of gotta, I guess this sounds really bad, but like see which way public opinion is going. I
yeah,
don't know if that makes
yeah,
sense. Yeah, it's like, like you get into it with stem cell therapy. So,
hmm,
there's you take a national poll, the vast majority of people be like, yeah, stem cells, great, let's start using them. But then it seems to be, ruled by the minority in that. So yeah, in terms of the ethics of it. So
yeah.
yeah,
It's it's so hard to try and justify things for the greater good for science, but at the same time, when you're dealing with human lives, and you can see this study firsthand, how many lives it ruined,
yeah,
and it's that's why I feel like these ethical forms, that they shouldn't be, just a blank slate. Here, sign this, cover our ass type of thing. It should be really covered and talked about, and something that I should, or moving forward, if I have to have a patient sign an informed consent, be like, hey, this is really important for you to know. I think that's kind of like
yeah,
probably my biggest takeaway from this whole thing
yeah.
is really how important it really is.
I think that's great. I think my biggest takeaway is that there needs to be some third party oversight. It can't just be the ethics community of an institution overseeing the studies that are done there. There has to be some
Hmm.
outside oversight in terms of reviewing the ethics of the studies that go on, whether that be the federal government or the state government or some third party entity or whatever. But the pushback from the scientists and the people doing the research is like, yeah, we agree that there needs to be oversight, but not to the extent where it starts squashing the progression of scientific research. It's a fine balance, and it,
Hmm.
depending on the way things work, it swings one way or another, as the wind blows. So finding that balance of maintaining ethical integrity while also progressing science is very difficult to do sometimes. So
Yeah,
yeah.
agreed. Well, I think that pretty much covers everything. We'll make sure we submit all of our references and all that. Um,
Yep.
so, well, cool. I think
Awesome.
that will I'll go ahead and end the recording unless you have
Right
anything
on.
else to add.
Nope, I'm good.
Cool. All right.
Wait.
Well, how do I stop it? There we go.